Hello everyone, Coach Robert here with another calculation video. One of the important ideas in chess is the notion that every move has both pros and cons. There is no move which has no downsides except perhaps the move when you give a checkmate. So some common downsides for any of the chess moves that you make include loss of control of some important squares. For instance, when you move a piece that's protecting your king from a checkmate, that's not good. So the downside of your move, it might have other good things about it, but the downside is that it might enable your opponent to take control of those important squares right away. Another example of a drawback could be a permanent weakness. This usually happens when we're moving pawns. So this drawback principle is especially important when we're talking about pawn moves or anything that has to do with the pawn structure. Another example could be the commitment of a piece to a flank or a rank or a file. So this is especially true for knights because knights are short-range pieces. It takes them a long time to cross the board. So if you send your knight to the queen side and it turns out that the king side is important, that'll be a drawback of having sent your knight to the queen side. Another example could be the loss of time. So there are clearly many kinds of downsides for chess moves, right? They obviously have lots of different kinds of assets as well. So how good your move is some kind of balance of the pros of that move and the cons of that move, or the drawbacks. Well, that's all well and good, but like, how do we use this in a real game, right? So the way that I think we should use this is to attempt to select our candidate moves a little bit more carefully. Before you commence with any kind of deep calculation, it's good to have a sense of what all of your ideas are, what are all the factors at play in the position that you're in right now. And so identifying what those important factors are can take a lot of different forms. And I think one way that you can arrive at a good list of candidate moves is by asking yourself, what is the downside of the last move that was played? Or when you are evaluating one of your own candidate moves, you can ask yourself, what are the downsides of this move that I was about to play? So I'm going to show two examples. One where someone has played a move that has a downside and we try to identify it and then identify what move we should play based on that downside. And another where we're going to consider a move and then see if the downsides are worth it. So let's start with this example. So this one, white has just played rook a to d1. And it's black to play now. If you want to think about this just completely on your own, this would be a good time to pause the video. You should try to figure out what is the downside of this move, rook d1. And I'll just give you a little bit of a hint. So there's this problem in chess, which people sometimes call the problem of two rooks, where the rooks have very similar function and mobility early in the game, and you have to decide how to set up both rooks, but they're competing for squares. So this is an instance of the two rooks problem, but you should try to figure out specifically why there's a drawback for this one. Why is it not just, a purely good rook move? If you've thought about it for a little while, you might notice that when you play the move rook a d1, you are not only giving up the option to play rook b1 and rook c1 in a single move, but you are also depriving the other rook of the option to go to d1, c1, and b1. Now, most of these are not that important. In general, we want to put the rooks on files that have potential to be opened. So the main drawback here is that the rook is not on c1. This other rook on f1, you might also argue that it should be on d1, but e1 is also a good square for this rook. So the main downside that I think we should focus on right now is the rook not being able to go to c1 quickly anymore. So now that it's black's move, and we know that the downside of the move rook d1 is that the rook is differently placed. It's not necessarily worse placed, but it's definitely exerting a different kind of influence on d1 from what it did on c1. We should try to figure out how we can capitalize on that. So you might want to pause the video again and think about it. If you're thinking from black's perspective, you might have noticed that black is lacking space a little bit compared to white. These pawns in particular are giving white extra space, and if you don't know that much about space, I would highly recommend that you search up my video all about space on my YouTube channel. I give a lot of time for that one particular topic, and I hope that if you check it out, you'll have a good understanding of this at the end. So when we have less space, a few things we can try. We can try to trade pieces, And we can also try to clear away the pawns so our pieces at least are controlling some important squares and have room. And in this case, one of the things that we can do is attempt to open some files for our rooks and maybe open some diagonals for our bishops or clear a couple squares for our knights. The queen is probably fine wherever it is. So here you might want to pause again and ask yourself, what is the critical way for black to break through in this position? How is black going to clear up room for their pieces? You might have arrived at the conclusion that it should be c5. This is really the move that black should want to play. And if we do a quick analysis, we'll see that the position comes out at least not clearly better for white. It should be equal, roughly equal. You might even be more comfortable with black. The most critical test is if white takes here on d5 to try to create a weakness for this rook to look at long term. And then they'll play knight b5. Now here, if we don't move our bishop, they're going to take the bishop pair, and that could be pretty devastating. So bishop b8 makes a lot of sense. And I tried to pick a move here that makes sense that isn't knight c3. So I picked bishop f5 just to illustrate the point. And here, we can play a couple more moves, and it's pretty obvious, I think, that black is doing fine. Like maybe rook e8 to prevent white from ever playing e4. Maybe white activates their last piece here, and we can settle our knight here on e4 safely, which notably obstructs the queen and the bishop battery here. They're going to have to trade that bishop for something or else tuck it away on h3. Now you might say, big deal, this doesn't tell me why we should play c5. What does this have to do with the drawback principle? Let's look at the same idea of playing c5 if white had played rook c1. So they play rook a c1. Now here you might want to pause again and calculate the variation with c5 on your own. See if you can find any differences here. The difference in my mind is that after c5 and similar moves, so again white has created a target on d5 and they're trying to get the bishop pair. Here if we play the move bishop b8, which makes the most sense in my opinion, after the move d takes c5, the position is actually quite different because of this rook being on c1. Now, however we take on c5, there are some tactical problems. For instance, if we play knight takes c5 to try to avoid having a pawn on the c file that's vulnerable, they can immediately play the move bishop takes f6 and then take on h7, winning a pawn. And it's a pretty clear, healthy pawn. You know, they have to move the king and then we can bring the bishop back, and white is doing perfectly fine. Up material, and now black has to prove something. Okay, so let's say we don't like that and we play b takes. See if you can find the problem with b takes c5 here. This will probably show the full reason that rook c1 was maybe a better move than rook d1, and that there's a downside for rook d1. Now in this instance, they can take on f6 again, and you might think it doesn't matter compared to the other variation because we don't have to take with the queen, we can take with the knight. But now this shows the point of the rook being on c1. Now after queen takes c5, we're losing a pawn, and this is probably in a worse way than losing the h-pawn. So, coming back to our first position. The move rook a c1 prevents the move c5, which is black's thematic way of clearing some room for the rooks, bishops, and knights. So rook c1 works against black's main idea here. And the downside of rook d1 is that it doesn't keep pressure on the c5 square, and therefore this is the best time for black to go ahead and play c5. So this is an instance of the drawback principle at work. This is how we can use this idea to actually make decisions at the board. I have another example here, so let's switch over to that one. Here white has just castled, and we're thinking for black, and I'm going to prompt you guys. There's a move that I want you to think about, and the move is h5. It's an interesting move, but does it have any drawbacks? And how do the drawbacks weigh up against the benefits of h5? It's a hard question. I think it's open to debate, but it at least shows the utility of this way of thinking, even if the ultimate conclusion is a little bit unclear. So pause the video, think about it. What are the drawbacks of h5, and is it worth it to go ahead and play it? If you thought that the drawback of h5 is this move bishop g5, you're correct. Or more generally, white's ability to control the g5 square, either now or later. It doesn't have to be immediate. At any rate, later on in the game, g5 is available for the white pieces. This was not true before the move h5, because in this position, like, let's pretend that white had actually played bishop g5 just to illustrate our purpose. Here, we could probably go ahead and play h6 and just kick that bishop out of here. If you're worried about this happening, the bishop pair is good compensation in this example. Also, if white castles, we can play rook g8, so it's not really such a big deal. They cannot occupy the g5 square, they cannot use that square effectively. But after h5, it's a different story. They don't even have to go there immediately, and white can use the g5 square. Now, let's weigh this up against the benefit of h5. The benefit of h5 is that we get extra control of the g4 square. And you might think, so what, big deal. Let's see a couple more moves from this game. They played b4, which is fine. And after bishop b2, you might want to pause again and see if you can find out the purpose. Like, why does it help us to control the g4 square? The reason is that we can play the move knight g4. This is sort of like your fishing pole trap. Although it's not by any means forced for them to take this knight. This would lead to black having a really outstanding position. They probably have to sacrifice at least a pawn here by playing like maybe e5 in order to prevent pawn takes f3 followed by queen h2, either mate or a tremendous position, depending on what white played on the previous move. So this is the point behind h5, is to help us to play knight g4. And they don't have to take the knight, but they're always going to have to deal with this sort of uncomfortable pressure with queen h2 looming. They can never really play any knight move, not with this knight on f3. So this is an example where we could debate whether it's worth it or not to play h5, because clearly it sharpens the play, it gives black some chances to win, but it does create a permanent weakness. And I'm sort of inclined at this point to think that the permanent weakness is more significant, because they really don't have to respond to knight g4. It's nice, like black's playing actively, but g5 is like a real asset for white. In the game, they didn't turn out to utilize that, so there's no point in really exploring it here, in my opinion. But it's food for thought. This is the drawback principle at work. We should think about our own moves, thinking about their downsides and their drawbacks before we play them, and we should also attempt to select better candidate moves by asking ourselves, what was the downside of the last move that my opponent played, or even moves previous to that one. So I hope you guys like this video, and if you do, feel free to check out my other content. Until next time, good luck with your chess.